Okay, the title of my talk is Cuban Missile Crisis, UN-mediated conflict resolution. I said UN-mediated and I put dots between after the U and the N because I didn't want it to be thought of unmediated conflict resolution. In fact, the point of my talk is that it was mediated by the UN. There's a lot of conceptions and misconceptions about the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's generally thought, and I think it's generally true, that it's the most dangerous point in history where the world came closest to blowing itself up to a nuclear war. That's certainly true from a military to military point of view. There may have been times in human history and post-World War II where we came closer, but we don't know about it because somehow it was averted and it's still kept secret. But from a military to military point of view, the two powers were on a collision course with each other. The Strategic Air Command was brought to DEFCON 2, Defense Condition 2, which was the closest to actual war, which is DEFCON 1. And this was a very tense time. There was actually blood spilt between the two superpowers. Soviet surface-to-air missiles shot down an American pilot who was flying U-2 over Cuba. The US was dropping depth charges to force a Soviet submarine to surface, and the Soviets thought this was the beginning of a nuclear war. And two of the three officers were authorized the use of a nuclear-armed torpedo against the US ships that they felt were attacking it. The US had communicated to the Soviet Union that they were dropping depth charges in order to cause the submarine to surface. But the submarine did not get that message, so they thought this was actually an attack on them. And two of the three commanders decided that they would authorize the use of those nuclear-armed torpedoes, which the American military did not even know of. And one commander decided to vote no, and because the procedure required three commanders to all agree, he was the deputy in command of that particular submarine, that they didn't launch that nuclear torpedo. And that's come to light now as we find out a lot about what happened during the Soviet era after the fall of the Berlin Wall. So that was one more indication of how close we came to the beginning of a nuclear war. A misconception is that the Cuban Missile Crisis was just 13 days. No, it was over a month long. If you actually look at the beginning of the crisis in October 16th, and the quarantine, which was imposed by the US government, the Navy putting a blockade on Cuba, didn't end until November 20th. So that's over 1 month of the crisis. And so there's a lot more story to be told than just the typical 13 days, which was the time which most involved the Kennedy Executive Committee, where many people were sleeping on the couches in the White House and other places, just in order to be close by if war were to be launched, in order to help make some of those very difficult decisions. The conflict was not just eyeball to eyeball and the other side blinked, as is a common catchphrase, that this was a show of military might and the Soviet Union backed down in the face of US military might. It was far from that. It was a negotiated settlement. There were negotiations going on bilaterally and a parallel track at the United Nations. And what people don't know is that the UN track was very high level and actually very fruitful. And I'll describe that during the talk. Also, it was mediated. It was a mediated conflict settlement. The UN Secretary-General performed the role of mediator in various ways. He shuttled information between teams who were stationed at UN headquarters. He provided sounding block for ideas. And he also was making proposals himself, including the basic idea that formed the basis of the settlement, which was the withdrawal of missiles from Cuba in exchange for a non-invasion pledge by the US government that they would not invade Cuba. So this was all a story that needs to be told, and I'm very happy to share with you today the ways in which the UN was instrumental in doing this. But in order to catch the mood and give the background, there's nothing better than a bit of Hollywood, just to be able to get a few of the tense moments that were felt in the United States at that time. So a little bit of drama to serve as background for the presentation on what actually happened during the crisis. The film 13 Days is relatively accurate from the point of view of what it wants to show, which is what was happening in the Executive Committee of the National Security Council of President Kennedy. It doesn't show the mediation that happened with the UN, and this is the purpose of the talk today, to show you that there was another side, an international dimension to the solution of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So the background to all this, of course, it was a tense moment of the Cold War. In 1957, the Soviet Union had put the first satellite into orbit around the Earth, Sputnik, and there was a fear that spread like wildfire through the United States and indeed the Western world that somehow the Soviet Union would gather domination, would gain domination in space, and that it would then be able to dominate the Earth. And that there was a space race going on, and the Americans were seen to be behind in the beginning in getting their rockets off the ground. And when Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet premier, boasted that he was having intercontinental ballistic missiles coming out of Soviet factories like sausages, it caused a huge amount of fear of a missile gap. And behind that was the development of the Berlin Wall. Well, earlier, 48, the Berlin Blockade, then 1961, the Berlin Wall. And the only solution that the West had come up with is really an insane solution. It was called mutually assured destruction, a truly mad situation and mad strategy, which meant that if the Soviet Union were to launch a nuclear weapon at the United States, then the response would be full retaliation, wiping out the Soviet Union and any of the other targets that were on the US targeting list. And that was mutually assured destruction between the two superpowers, and it was an idea that would give rise to stability. Now, it may have contributed somewhat to stability, but it was a Damocles sword over the heads of the worlds, of the peoples of the worlds, and that meant that we were all living in greater danger. And it's very thankful that we didn't actually end up in a nuclear war, and part of that thanks goes to who thought. The US had already put intermediate range ballistic missiles into Italy and Turkey, which were in striking range of Moscow. So this was an idea that the US would be able to get closer to Moscow and then be able to make up for some of that bomber gap that had happened in the 1950s and the missile gap late 50s, early 60s. Well, Khrushchev was vacationing and in Bulgaria, and he heard that there was there were US nuclear missiles very close by, virtually on the border of the Soviet Union. And so he said, well, let's try and see if we can do something similar to the United States as they've done to us. So he planned a secret deployment of the missiles into Cuba so that they would become operational before the United States found out about it. The US was already, or by that time, had already made a faulty invasion. They had sent an attack to the Bay of Pigs in April of 1961 and tried to overthrow the Castro government, which was now seen to be a Soviet client state. And that meant that, that the US had shown its aggression, so the Soviet Union figured that Cuba needed protection, and that the weapons, they would say, were defensive. They would later argue that they were purely defensive weapons, these nuclear weapons, although from a point of view of categorizing what weapons are purely defensive versus purely offensive, nuclear weapons would be among the most offensive. But the US also had an embarrassment because the Bay of Pigs turned out to be a fiasco when the US supported ex-Cubans invaded into Cuba and were repulsed and captured by the Cuban Castro military. And so there was a lot of people who were extremely incensed by the actions of the US government. And so there was already embarrassment, and Khrushchev felt, well, he can push his luck. So in 1962, they started this deployment of nuclear weapons in there. And then the background was the US desire to be able to knock off Castro, under Operation Mongoose, to actually try and assassinate him. And that operation continued until 30th of October, and actually during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And you know, the various strategies the U.S. was considering and tried were sometimes humorous, like exploding cigars and whatnot. But that was all background to this larger issue of the missiles in Cuba. Premier Nikita Khrushchev was both charming and threatening the West. He came to the UN, spoke in the General Assembly, the famous shoe on the table incident. He sincerely believed that the Soviet system was a superior one, that communism would prevail in human destiny. And he was delighted to have a new ally in Fidel Castro in Cuba. And so at the same time as Khrushchev was charming the West, he was also frightening the West because of his rhetoric and because of the possibility that the Soviet Union might actually gain superiority in weapons and space and in allies. Well, on October 16th, 1962, Kennedy was informed of the nuclear missile-based construction in Cuba. This is a picture of the MRBM, medium-range ballistic missile field launch site in San Cristobal. And it was taken on the 14th of October by U-2. That was the first evidence of a missile construction in Cuba. Before that, they knew about missiles to protect the Soviet, Cuban territory, that's surface air missiles. But these were medium range. And these missiles could have a range that could reach as far as Hudson's Bay. Medium and intercontinental ballistic missiles were found there. And the range would cover Washington, couldn't go quite as far as Seattle, but it was a threat to the homeland of the United States. Of course, Florida was only 90 miles away from Cuba. And so this was seen as a real change in the strategic picture. The Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, thought at the time this wouldn't change the real strategic picture because there were ICBMs were already online and they could hit the heartland of the United States within 15 minutes. But others said that psychologically, to bring nuclear weapons so close to the territory of the United States would be a huge psychological blow. And Kennedy was very fearful of the Republicans who would chew him up in the election of November 1962. When there was an interim election between the presidential election of 60 and 64, and that he wanted to make sure that this didn't become an issue for the Republicans to gain power in the House and Senate. Well, here's a closer picture as they went lower in altitude, started to get better images of what was there, including the heavy equipment, the missile transporters, the guideline missiles, the missile dollies, cylinder tanks for fuel, and transporters. So the picture came very clear to the XCOM. And at first Kennedy decided, let's do these things in secret, let's negotiate or at least decide what our next step is, because he didn't want to rush into it. Meanwhile, the Joint Chiefs of Defense Staff, and particularly the head of Strategic Air Command, wanted the US to start bombing. Take these missiles out before they became operational. And he was told that they become operational around the 22nd or 23rd of October. And that meant that there was a huge pressure to do something by then. So Kennedy explored various options, and one of them was to look at using the UN. And the Secretary-General of the UN was informed on Saturday, that's the 18th of October, that there would be, sorry, the 20th of October, that the US had evidence of missiles. In fact, the military advisor of the Secretary-General, Major General Inderjit Ricky, was brought to the Pentagon, given a binder full of images of the missiles, and he was able to tell the Secretary-General about the very conclusive evidence that the United States had of missiles inside Cuba. And Inderjit Ricky told me at one point that he gave that binder to the Pearson Peacekeeping Center because they took his archives as a peacekeeper. And I know the archives of the Pearson Peacekeeping Center were stored at the Carleton University, so if someone ever had the energy, they could go look for that binder that came out of the Cuban Missile Crisis from Inderjit Ricky. Well, the executive committee, known as the XCOM, met in the White House in order to deliberate about the US response. And the final decision that Kennedy made was that they would do a stepwise escalation. And that was, the first was to declare a naval blockade. But since blockade is an act of war in international law, It was decided by an official in the State Department who had the opportunity to show the original work done on this too, Abram Chase, who proposed the word quarantine, so it would become more politically acceptable and wouldn't be seen to be starting a war. So the quarantine was established around Cuba. The main players in the executive committee were the National Security Advisor, George Bundy, who originally told Kennedy about the presence of missiles inside Cuba. The Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, who was looking to involve the UN as much as possible. The Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, who was also trying to make sure that his chiefs and the military didn't make a small mistake that could escalate into a nuclear war. These are the Joint Chiefs. On Kennedy's far right is Curtis LeMay, the head of Strategic Bomber Command, and also known as Strategic Air Command. And he was among the most hawkish of the hawks in demanding that the U.S. Take out the missile sites as soon as possible. And when Kennedy was asking, where can you get all the missiles, then the answer came, we can get all the missiles that we know of. But that wouldn't have been good enough for the start of a nuclear exchange had they used the missiles that weren't taken out in the first strike. On the international scene, the main protagonists or antagonists were Kennedy and Khrushchev, the American president and the Soviet premier, and Uthon became a mediator between them. Khrushchev used the words mediator in his correspondence with Kennedy, and in fact the evidence shows that he was a mediator. Now Kennedy had to come public about what was going on. There was already so many rumors swirling around Washington. There was mobilization of forces in Florida for a potential invasion. Over 90,000 mobilized and deployed in Florida. And Kennedy made the announcement, he addressed the nation on October 22nd, and I'll give you actual, not the Hollywood version, but the actual version, a few seconds from Kennedy's original address.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
So that's the beginning of that very stern address where Kennedy announced that the blockade would start on Wednesday, the 24th of October. This is a sense of the blockade. The Soviet ships and Soviet chartered ships were on their way towards Cuba, and the U.S. military was stationing its forces actually well beyond this particular blockade zone here in order to intercept, board, and stop Soviet ships, or any ships for that matter, carrying any items that the United States considered to be offensive weaponry. The United States tried to force the Soviet Foxtrot submarines, which were escorting the Soviet chartered ships, to force them to the surface and send them back to the Soviet Union, not aware that there were nuclear-armed, nuclear-tipped torpedoes on those submarines. And as I mentioned, the Soviets were in very dire conditions. They were 2 weeks underwater without surfacing. They lost their air conditioning, so temperatures were reaching 120 degrees Fahrenheit. And the Soviet officers were in desperate straits, thinking that there might actually be nuclear war. So that was one potential flashpoint, unfortunately averted. The U.S. destroyer Joseph P. Kennedy, named after John F. Kennedy's brother who died in the Second World War, stops and boards and inspects a Soviet chartered ship of Lebanese registry in order to show that the United States was serious about their quarantine zone. And meanwhile, the Soviet troops were encamped in Cuba and were preparing for war, and the missiles were becoming operational. There were 24-hour around-the-clock efforts to try and get them into operations. The United States used the World Forum of the Security Council in order to raise its point of view, and of course the Soviet Union was trying to defend its point of view. The Soviet ambassador, Zorin, was very defensive, and it's quite possible that in the early stages he himself didn't know about the missiles in Cuba, so his strategy was to delay and downplay all of the American fears. On the American side, Adlai Stevenson was a very serious political figure, and twice presidential candidate for U.S. presidency of the Democratic Party, and he was making the case that the Soviet Union was making a threat to the peace in the presence of missiles in Cuba. And the presidency of the Security Council, the rotating presidency, happened to be in the USSR hands. And as the custom since the formation of the Security Council, the Secretary-General sits on the right side of the President of the Security Council, and there you can see U Thant. And originally, when U Thant made his original proposals, Zorin was very angry with U Thant, saying, "Why aren't you denouncing the American blockade? Why are you trying to make some sort of middle zone?" But I'll tell you a little bit what happened with that proposal and with the ambassador's remarks. So the Americans managed to get the OAS to give them some legitimacy for their blockade when the Latin Americans in the Organization of American States decided that they would support an American blockade. As well, Latin Americans and many neutral, non-aligned countries wanted to get the UN involved because the whole world was worried about nuclear war. I mean, people were looking at what kind of shelters they had in order to protect against a nuclear bomb. And 65 nations asked U Thant to please intervene in the crisis. As you can see from this title of the Globe and Mail, Delegation Prepares Plea to U Thant for intervention. So U Thant decided on his own initiative to send identical appeals to Khrushchev and to Kennedy. He asked in that set of appeals that the Soviet vessels stay away from the interception area, and that Kennedy withdraw the quarantine, and they begin talks, even that night, which was October 24th, the UN day, in order to resolve this crisis. He wanted the parties to move away from this conflict, this collision at sea that the world was fearful of. And so the talks were started within a matter of a day or two, but Kennedy didn't agree to this proposal. He said that he can't withdraw the quarantine unless the missile sites in Cuba are stopped, that there's no more construction going on. And so Kennedy was in a quandary. He didn't want to seem like he was holding back the peace process. So what he did is he actually proposed to U Thant that another suggested wording that he could agree to. Meanwhile, Khrushchev sent a response back saying, "Yes, I agree to your proposal, which is in the interest of peace." Until that time, the Soviets had said that the United States was acting like piracy, and that they were violating international law, and they were not going to back down, and they were going to continue their ships. But this was the first evidence that Khrushchev could negotiate. As the New York Times headline shows, Thant bids US and Russia desist 2 weeks. So the front page banner headline about how the Secretary-General wanted to make a proposal to be able to halt this collision course towards disaster. Now, when the Soviet ships started to slow on the morning of October 24th, that's where the Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, made that famous comment. Now, already at that point, the Soviets were showing that they were they weren't going to defy the quarantine outright, but they still kept some ships moving forward, but they stopped most of them. And that's when Dean Rusk made that famous statement, "We're eyeball to eyeball, and I think the other fellow just blinked." So that showing that this quarantine was working. But still, some ships continued, and the U.S. was keeping track of them.
Didn't Kennedy, in his cooperative way, didn't he decide to move the quarantine boundary back?
I'm not aware that they actually moved the quarantine. At one point, they tried to tell the Soviets where the quarantine was by sending a message through U Thant to the Soviets. But, and I have that document that I pulled out of the UN archives, and we can see from that where the quarantine is positioned. But it's also true that the Soviet ambassador declined to actually accept that. He just said, no, we don't accept the quarantine as legal. We don't even want to know about that. On the Cuban side, here you have Fidel Castro seeing the mobilization and seeing the overflights, which were now coming at treetop level over Cuba. And he thought that this was going to be a situation of invasion. And he wrote to Khrushchev saying, we're prepared as Cubans and as communists to make a sacrifice for the cause of communism. And he was pushing Khrushchev towards launching the first strike, towards nuclear war. So willing to have the destruction of his people in the process. And that's very scary. And it meant Khrushchev thought, well, I have a very unstable ally here, because the purpose of those missiles is to be deterrent, not to actually use them. We don't want to use nuclear weapons. So that added a third dimension of uncertainty. Now back to Kennedy's request. He sent an appeal to U Thant to make an alternative suggestion, another proposal. And in fact, they had the Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, phone U Thant at midnight on October 24th and say, could you please make this new appeal? And U Thant said that he'd certainly consider it in the morning. At 2 o'clock, these exact words were sent from Washington. They'd been worked out by Kennedy and his advisors, that would be sent to U Thant, and U Thant considered it in the morning. And what he wanted was an expression of concern that Soviet ships might be under instruction to challenge the quarantine and constantly create a confrontation at sea. And concern that that kind of possibility might destroy the talks that had been suggested by U Thant. That the hope, that U Thant expressed a hope that Soviet ships will be held out of the interception area, an expression of confidence from U Thant that the Americans would avoid a direct confrontation during the same period in order to minimize the possibility of untoward incident. So this is a way of Kennedy getting out of a compromise situation where he had to agree to the withdrawal of the quarantine. He just said that the United States would avoid direct confrontation with Soviet ships. Well, U Thant made that proposal the next day, October 25th, and of course Kennedy was very quick to accept that because it was his own proposal. That's very typical of a mediator being used to find acceptable provisions for both sides. So Soviet vessels to stay away from the interception area, and US vessels to do everything possible to avoid direct confrontation. Khrushchev, as a reply to the first appeal came in, I agree with your proposal, which meets the interests of peace. Here's a document which I got from the UN archives of the actual letter. It's got U Thant's little initials at the top, meaning that's the copy that he got. And he got it on October 25th, while a Security Council debate was raging in the Security Council. Now, prior to that debate, just prior, Ambassador Stephenson was on the phone with President Kennedy on the payphone just outside of the Security Council in New York. And Kennedy wanted U Thant, he wanted Stephenson to go easy on the Soviets while he's giving them a way out, while he might say yes to U Thant's second proposal. And Stephenson was wanted to go very hard, but he was almost going to defy the orders of the president. But then he decided no, that he would actually he would go slow at the beginning, until at one point, about halfway through his address, he gets a note saying that Khrushchev has accepted U Thant's proposal. And then he felt, now I can go all out. So you'll actually see in the address how there's a change in spirit between the two parts of U Thant's, of Stephenson's address to the Security Council. And here's some excerpts. I'll start off at the beginning with Zorin speaking as the chair on October 25th.
Let me ask you one simple question. Do you, Ambassador Zorin, deny that the USSR has placed and is placing medium and intermediate range missiles and sites in Cuba? Yes or no? Don't wait for the translation, yes or no?
I should like to say
Продолжайте вашу речь, господин Стивенсон. В свое время вы получите ответ.
Mr. Stephenson, would you continue your statement, please? You will receive the answer in the due course. Do not worry.
I'm prepared to wait for my answer until hell freezes over, if that's your decision. And I'm also prepared to present the evidence in this room.
So Stephenson went on to present the evidence with the actual U-2 photographs and other photographs of the missile sites inside of Cuba. And there's one little interchange in that same debate which I thought was worthy of mention, and that is at one point the Soviet ambassador says, well, I'm not prepared to be addressed as you would in an American courtroom, as a prosecutor does in the American courtroom, like when Stephenson was pressing the case. And then Stephenson had a great comeback line saying, "Sir, you are now before the court of world opinion." So such was the way. There was the televised proceedings in the United States. In fact, Kennedy was watching it in the White House as this exchange was going on, and around the world when the world was seeing two sides make their case. Well, the evidence was becoming quite clear from the imagery that the United States was providing, including on that easel in the UN Security Council. And that next day, the Khrushchev response, the second appeal came. And that was even stronger, saying, "I therefore accept your proposal and have ordered the masters of Soviet vessels to stay out of the interception area as you recommend." So that was more definitive. And having heard the positive response of the United States, you could say that this deal was now agreed to between the parties, as they both saw that they both agreed to it. So the New York Times banner headline, "Kennedy agrees to talks on Font plan. Khrushchev accepts, blockade goes on, Russian tanker intercepted and cleared," on the way, with a picture of the famous easel in the Security Council, and remarks about the exchange between Stephenson and Zorin. The Global Mail banner headline was, "Soviet-US agree to hold preliminary talks on Cuba, high drama in UN as Stevenson-Zorin clash at meeting," and then some remarks about what the Secretary-General is planning. Well, the Secretary-General went into overdrive there, trying to work with Zorin. Originally, Zorin didn't even want to accept Uthant's proposals, but when Khrushchev said yes, then Zorin had to accept them because they were coming from the head of his state, the head of his government. And so here's an example where they started to work closely together to try and come up with a solution. But the United States felt that Stephenson might be weak or soft on the communists, so they sent in John McCloy, who had been Assistant Secretary of War in the Second World War, to go to New York and head up the U.S. team. In Washington, they called it the UN team, the team of negotiators at the UN. And then Vasily Kuznetsov, the first deputy foreign minister of the Soviet Union, was sent to New York, and they headed up teams which included their ambassadors and others as well. And they formed a high-powered team in order to bring these negotiations to some sort of fruitful ending. Now, on that debate on October 24th in the evening, Font quotes Cuban President Osvaldo Dorticos. And he saw in a speech that Dorticos had given 2 weeks earlier that there was a potential solution, that he was seeing a way that this general communist rhetoric could be used in order to find a particular solution to this particular crisis. So the Dorticos quote is, "If the United States would give us assurances by word and deed that would not commit acts of aggression against our country, we solemnly declare that there would be no need for our weapons and our armies." That's typical communist propaganda, general and complete disarmament when the threat is withdrawn. So Uthant said Here again, I feel that on the basis of discussion, some common ground might be found through which we may be traced out of our present impasse. And this converted the communist propaganda into a practical solution. If the United States gave those assurances against an invasion, then there would be no need for the nuclear missiles inside Cuba. And he pushed that idea. He phoned Rusk. He tried to do everything to get that on the U.S. agenda, when the United States wasn't even considering that. They were considering a range of other options, and this was a very important contribution. He proposed a standstill on missile site construction in exchange for a U.S. pledge not to invade Cuba, as an interim solution to give parties time to negotiate. So stop the construction and pledge not to invade.
So was you the person who thought of that idea?
That's right, that's correct.
It didn't come from anyone in the United States? No.
There are some historians who are looking through the archives. They think that it may have actually been a Soviet proposal done by a KGB agent inside the United Nations, but there's no evidence to back that one up. So, but in historical terms, we know that U Thant was the one who captured those words from the Cuban president and made them into
so
a...
the KGB agent story is just sort of fictional, do you think?
Well, I can't say for sure. Some very well-known historians, May and Zelikow, proposed it in their book, The Kennedy Tapes. So there might be a bit of truth to it, but we've tried to do searches in the UN archives for any of the MSAT. We didn't find it. Meanwhile, back in Washington, Kennedy and Rusk were trying to hold off the Hawks, who wanted an invasion bombing of the Cuban sites, and followed by an invasion force. And they often referred to U Thant. U Thant is having these talks, so we can't escalate. We can't move into prohibiting petroleum, oil, and lubricants, POL ships coming into Cuba. We have to only look for those that might be carrying offensive weapons. So we won't continue with the night search. We won't inspect a certain ship. And all these were used as reasons to stop an escalation, that they were worried a small spark might light this huge fire of a nuclear war. And they used U Thant, saying, while U Thant's talks are going on, we can't possibly take these escalatory moves. So that was a good tool that the Kennedy brothers could use to keep the Hawks at bay. Well, October 27th is known as Black Saturday. There were a number of events that came together, and the world was very close to nuclear war. The United States was pressing at the sea. That's the incident where the Soviet Foxtrot submarines were forced to surface after the U.S. Destroyers and aircraft carriers were dropping depth charges to draw the Soviet ships to the surface. And it was the courageous act of a deputy commander of one of those Soviet submarines who managed to stop the Soviets from firing their one nuclear torpedo per submarine. That same day, the first blood was spilt. The Soviets had surface air missiles in Cuba. They shot at a U-2, and they brought the U-2 down into the territory of Cuba, and killing the pilot, Major Rudolph Anderson. So now you had a casus belli, and the United States feeling that they have to take an escalatory step. And already Kennedy had already said that if there were to be striking of US planes, that the United States would take out the sites that had shot down the plane. And so there was already a necessity from the military point of view to respond and take out those sites. At the same time, Kennedy heard that a U-2 had gone stray. It had taken off in Alaska and was flying over the Soviet Union in Soviet territory. And the big fear in the executive committee is that the Soviets would see this as a reconnaissance mission prior to an invasion, see where the Soviet forces are deployed. And so the big fear was the Soviets might see that incorrectly. So the MiGs were scrambled on the Soviet sides, the Americans scrambled their fighter jets, and they were able to bring the U-2 back into American airspace before the MiGs could catch up. Otherwise, it could very well have been an air-to-air escalation of force and shooting down, leading to nuclear war, possibly. In addition, the military, without Kennedy's permission, had done a nuclear test in the Pacific on October 26th. And when he found out about it, that only contributed to this sense that Kennedy thought that they were pushing the Soviet Union into a corner, and that this could be a prelude to much worse things. So Kennedy sent his brother Robert, Bobby Kennedy, to meet with the Soviet ambassador in Washington, Anatoly Dobrinin. And in that meeting on the Saturday, he offered the removal of US Jupiter missiles from Turkey. And this was to be kept as a secret deal, that it wasn't being made public because Kennedy didn't want the bad press of backing down to the Soviets and actually withdrawing missiles from a NATO ally. At the same time, Kennedy had given Rusk instructions that if the Soviets did not accept this deal as a secret form, that he should send a note to the president of Columbia University, who used to be a chief of staff of the Secretary-General in the UN, to give to U Thant, to make U Thant make public a proposal of a deal. The proposal would be that the US should withdraw its Turkish missiles in exchange for the Soviet Union withdrawing the Cuban missiles. That was called the Courtier Maneuver, named after Andrew Courtier, who was previously been in the United Nations and who had very close ties to the UN. But that signal was never sent to Courtier by Rusk because the secret deal was accepted by the Soviet Union. Accepted, rather ironically, the Soviet Union, which was the source of so much secrecy and skullduggery during the Cold War, would accept a secret deal, which the United States wanted to keep secret, and the US being the democracy and transparency and openness, because the US didn't want the embarrassment, the Democrats in the White House didn't want the embarrassment of seeming to be backing down to the Soviets. So this was ideal, and the Soviets ended up accepting it. Khrushchev said, "We are face to face with the danger of war and of nuclear catastrophe, with the possible result of destroying the human race. To save the world, we must retreat." And so he did. He gave the orders for the construction, the missiles in Cuba to be dismantled. So we had this problem of, we had the situation where the people were working 24 hours around the clock in order to make those missiles operational. Then they were given orders, dismantle them immediately. So they were working 24 hours around the clock to dismantle them. At that time, Thant decided to accept Castro's invitation to Havana and seek Castro's consent for a UN mission to verify the dismantling of these sites. So October 28th, the day after the Black Saturday, was this possibility of having the United States and the Soviet Union come to an agreement, and that the missiles were being dismantled, and so it came to be. This is the New York Times headlines. US and Soviet reach accord on Cuba. Kennedy accepts Khrushchev's pledge to remove missiles under UN watch. So the UN, in all of the US plans, was to oversee the withdrawal of these missiles. And then the subtitle here being, Thant sets visits. He will go to Havana tomorrow to seek Castro consent. Meanwhile, talks were going on at the UN. You had Vasily Kuznetsov, along with John McCloy, enhanced by the ambassadors, as you can see in this picture, who were part of the joint talks. And they were looking at the modalities, how to make formal what the leaders had made in a very general way, in this exchange of cables, which were long rattling cables without definitive wording that both leaders said, now we agree exactly to that. So this purpose of the UN negotiations was to fill out what was the leaders had agreed to and come to many of the details, and as well as agree with the verification measures. So U Thant's job was to be able to Castro to agree to this withdrawal of missiles, as well as work out some sort of verification measures. So I show in this picture the military advisor of the Secretary-General, Indrajit Ricky, on the far right in the top picture, and second from the right, that is stage right in that picture, as they're about to leave for Cuba. So at the time, the UN was given a lot of recognition for what it was doing in Cuba. And here's a little clip from the media about how the events were seen inside of the newsreels. Crisis eases.
The curtain goes up at the United Nations on what the world hopes is the final act in the drama that was the Cuban crisis. The Soviet Union is represented by Khrushchev's special envoy, Russia's first deputy foreign minister, Vasily Kuznetsov. He is here to confer with Utante before the acting Secretary-General left for Cuba to arrange the dismantling of Soviet missile bases. Utante met separately with both Russian and United States representatives to iron out some preliminary details before his conferences with Castro. It is planned that observers from nations not allied with either side will supervise the removal of the sites. Then it is hoped the final curtain will fall.
So you can see that the UN role was highlighted at the time in both newspapers, as you saw from the New York Times, as well as some of the newsreels of the day. Here the New York Times states, "Fon's Cuba talks fruitful. He will fly to Havana tomorrow or today. Blockade halted during the trip." So President Kennedy, as an act of goodwill, decided that they would stop the quarantine. They would officially withdraw it during the period that Utante was inside Cuba. And recall that his first proposal was for a stoppage of the quarantine. And so this was Kennedy's way of responding to that first proposal and showing goodwill as the UN chief confers. And they show pictures here of the negotiations going on at the United Nations. Utante traveled to Cuba, and there he had consultations with Castro. He managed to get Castro to tone down some of his rhetoric and some of his opposition to the situation and the withdrawal of missiles. But Castro did not agree to any verification, any UN observers on Cuban territory. One important activity that Utante performed was to get first-hand information from the general who was commanding the Soviet forces in Cuba that the dismantling was going on. He was even offered the possibility of going to the sites and seeing it for himself that the dismantling was going on. Utante said that he believed the general and he didn't need to visit the sites. But he brought back this evidence which he had and the discussions and the details about when the missiles would be completely dismantled, which the Soviet general had promised would be in 3 days. That is by November 2nd. At that point, Utante wrote, he wrote in his memoirs that at that point he was practicing his daily meditation. He was a Buddhist pacifist in theory, and he wrote that he was doing his morning meditation, practicing metta and karuna, goodwill and compassion, but he kept seeing in his mind's eye the American destroyers off the coast of Havana and thinking about the destruction that could come. And he said, it was very hard to still my mind, as you might imagine. Later on, he wrote notes about his meetings with Castro. I've given an example from the UN archive here, archives here, about the meeting on the 31st of October. He came back, announced the withdrawal that was pending and would be completed by November 2nd. He was able to talk about verification mission, and that he was unable to get the Castro to agree to the withdrawal of missiles. Back in New York, he worked on that issue until in the New York discussions, they agreed that the missiles would be verified bilaterally, that the Soviet Union would unwrap, take the tarpaulin off of the missiles on the ships, and American planes and ships alongside or above would be able to verify that the missiles were being withdrawn. They could actually count them. So this is an example here of the meeting that went on, and they continued to go on for several weeks afterwards. The Globe Mail states here that the Cuba quarantine is reimposed. Missiles will be down by Friday, says the UN. And the US begins surveillance again in order to see the dismantling process. And sure enough, the ships were coming out and they had their missiles on the board, on the decks of the ships, and the Americans could see by pulling up alongside or going atop that their missiles were actually there and they could count them. So make sure there weren't any rogue missiles back on the island. There were allegations of some being hidden in caves and whatnot. You can see how you can actually see the Soviet missiles on the decks of the ships. There was another problem besides missiles, and that were the bombers. The Soviets had also put Aleutian 28 jet bombers into Cuba who were capable of carrying nuclear payloads. And the United States said that was an offensive weapon, could be used on Americans. So he said that they have to be withdrawn too as part of the deal. So they were going back and forth. But Kennedy at one point instructed the US negotiating team in New York not to let the deal get hung up on the issue of the Aleutian jets. But the Soviet Union finally agreed, and when Khrushchev said we're withdrawing them, then Kennedy withdrew the quarantine. So that was on November 20th. After extensive negotiations on November 19th, Castro finally told Plant that he would agree to the removal of the Aleutian bombers. So Castro agreed to it. Kennedy withdrew the quarantine on November 20th. So the crisis wasn't just 13 days. It was from the 16th of October to the 20th of November. So well over a month. And here's actually a picture of a Soviet ship, the Kazimov, which has the fuselage of the Aleutian bombers aboard. So you can see how they're being brought out of Cuba back to the Soviet Union. Now, the story wasn't over because the agreement between the two leaders had not yet been finalized. There was just a cable exchange, but they hadn't come up with the exact wording. So they were looking at a common agreement, and when that couldn't happen, they decided that in the negotiations that there would be a draft protocol, and that the protocol would be signed by them. And then when that didn't work out, they decided they would have separate declarations of what they understand the agreement to mean. So I was able to dig out from the UN archives copies of the declarations from the United States, from the Soviet Union, and from Cuba, the draft declarations. Here the US draft declaration, it says, confidential, eyes only, Stephenson, which was passed on to the UN Secretary-General. You can see from his markings there, states that the US does not intend to invade Cuba. It provided that no nuclear weapons or other offensive weapons are reintroduced into Cuba, and provided that Cuba does not take action to threaten the peace of the Western Hemisphere. So what we see from that is that the US was pushing on one edge. Cuba made its own draft declaration, and the same thing with the Soviet Union. So those draft declarations were never declared in the Security Council as originally viewed. The leaders decided that they had enough of an agreement and the Turkish missiles were going to be withdrawn in a matter of months, that they could just go on that and leave it in an informal fashion. And so the negotiations of the UN allowed a better understanding of what that agreement was, but Kennedy didn't want to be seen to be giving in to Khrushchev, and so they never formalized that agreement, but they are on record, and they form part of the understanding between the two superpowers. Coming to my conclusions, we have to say that Thant's initiative gave Khrushchev a way out. That rather than backing down to the US military might, he was shown to be accepting a proposal of the UN Secretary-General, which in Khrushchev's words, was in the interests of peace. Kennedy saw the importance of an honorable alternative to his opponent and using a skilled intermediary in the form of the UN Secretary-General. The Thant formula saw the missile sites dismantled in a mere days, rather than the weeks that the Kennedy administration was foreseeing. And his proposal that he pushed hard to have this deal became the basis of the final settlement. Thant also received first-hand reports of the dismantling of the missiles in Cuba, and he was formed a shuttle. At different times, on the 38th floor of the UN General Assembly, of the UN Secretariat building, there were teams of Americans in one room and a team of Soviets in another, and Thant would actually shuttle between the rooms to be able to do a kind of shuttle diplomacy long before that process was given that term, shuttle diplomacy. So there was a negotiated and mediated conflict resolution. The UN served as a critical instrument between the superpowers. The general idea after the Second World War was that once the Cold War had come, the UN was useful for putting out bushfires, that it was useful for small conflicts, that they didn't get bigger. But there wasn't a sense that this would be used by the superpowers, which preferred to use their own negotiating teams and their own bilateral means and unilateral means and alliances But here it showed that the UN was actually useful to the superpowers when they were in the hot seat, when they were really under pressure to find some way to save the world. Adlai Stevenson later on said, when he was testifying before a Senate subcommittee on international organization, he said the Secretary General's intervention led to the diversion of Soviet ships headed for Cuba and interception by our Navy. This was the indispensable first step in the peaceful resolution of the Cuban crisis. U Thant was unanimously elected to an extended term on November 30th, 1962, and they actually said that his title of Acting Secretary General would now be dropped, and that the new title of Secretary General, without the word acting, would be retroactive to the beginning of his term as a kind of reward, because at first the Soviets did not want, when U Thant was elected, to have a Secretary General. They wanted to replace it with a troika because they were unhappy with the way Dag Hammarskjöld had been too independent. And so the action of U Thant in this crisis brought the Soviet back a renewed respect for the role of the Secretary General. And the Soviet and US teams in New York sent a letter to U Thant, and they declared that their discussion would be over in January of 1963, and they expressed the appreciation for the Secretary General's efforts in assisting our governments to avert the serious threat to the peace which recently arose in the Caribbean area. So some political cartoons to make the point, perhaps overblown, maybe I should use the word blown in this case, but perhaps overemphasized in these cartoons, but it shows the UN as a firewall between the nuclear powers, or the UN stopping the world from going over the precipice into free fall and nuclear war. President Kennedy later stated that U Thant has put the world deeply in his debt. Shortly thereafter, in 1963, the United States and the Soviet Union and other countries of the world signed the Partial Test Ban Treaty to ban the testing of nuclear weapons in the atmosphere and outer space. That was a big step forward towards a new form of negotiation and reducing the threat of nuclear weapons. And the picture you see is the Moscow Treaty, as it's called, the PTBT, Partial Test Ban Treaty, being toasted in Moscow with U Thant in the center. So this humble Secretary General played a major role, and I think we all owe literally our lives to you. And by that I don't mean you, the audience, I mean U Thant. Thank you very much.